In the summer of 1993, a piece of broken stone was pulled out of an ancient wall in northern Israel. It wasn't supposed to be there. It had been ripped from somewhere else, centuries earlier, and reused as ordinary building material by people who had no idea what they were burying. For nearly 3,000 years, it sat silent inside that wall. Then someone noticed the edge of a letter. What came out of the ground that day would do something no one had managed to do in over 100 years of digging across the entire Middle East. It would force historians to rewrite what they thought they knew about one of the most famous kings who ever lived. His name was David, and until this stone surfaced, there was a real possibility he never existed at all. For most of the 20th century, a growing number of scholars had started asking an uncomfortable question. The Bible describes David as a shepherd who became a king, the man who beat Goliath, the founder of a royal dynasty that was promised to last forever. But outside the Bible, there was nothing. No inscription, no monument, no mention in Egyptian records, Assyrian records, or anywhere else in the ancient world. Not one single line from anyone, anywhere, that proved a king named David had ever sat on a throne. For a ruler, the Bible describes as commanding a powerful kingdom. That silence was strange, and strange silences make historians suspicious. Some scholars began to argue that David wasn't a real king at all, that he was a legend, invented centuries later to give a small, struggling kingdom a glorious founding myth. The debate became one of the most heated in biblical archaeology, splitting scholars into two camps that, for decades, could not agree. Then, in July of 1993, at a dig site called Tel Dan in the far north of Israel, a member of the excavation team named Gila Cook spotted something jutting out of an old wall. The wall had been built using reused stones, recycled from an earlier structure that no longer existed. One of those recycled stones had writing on it. It was basalt, black, hard, ancient, and carved across its surface were lines of script in a language called Aramaic, the language of Israel's old enemies to the north. A year later, archaeologists found two more broken pieces of the same stone nearby. 3 fragments. Not the whole monument, maybe never the whole monument, but enough. Enough to read. The inscription was written by a king of Aram Damascus, a kingdom that had spent generations at war with Israel, and what he had carved into the stone was a victory boast, a message meant to be read by his own people, celebrating a battle he claimed to have won against his enemies to the south. Ancient kings did this constantly. They carved their triumphs into stone, often exaggerating, sometimes outright lying, because the stone wasn't written for historians 3,000 years later. It was written for propaganda, for prestige, for power. But buried in the middle of that boast was a phrase that made archaeologists go completely silent when they finally translated it. 3 words in ancient Aramaic. Read together, they meant House of David. It was the first time in human history that the name David had ever been found written by anyone outside the pages of the Bible. Not by his own people, not by a friendly scribe trying to flatter a dynasty, by an enemy king carving a victory speech who used the name David's royal line had built for itself as a way to identify the kingdom he claimed to have humiliated. Think about what that actually means. For an enemy king to use the phrase House of David as shorthand for an entire kingdom, that name had to already be famous. It had to be the way people across the region referred to that royal family, more than a century after David himself was supposed to have died. You don't name a kingdom after a king who never existed. You don't build a political identity around a myth that your enemies recognize instantly enough to use it as an insult. This was the first physical evidence, completely independent of Scripture, that a king named David had been real enough and powerful enough to have an entire dynasty named after him. Naturally, a discovery this explosive did not go unchallenged. Some scholars who had spent years arguing David was a myth pushed back immediately. They questioned the translation. Could those 3 Aramaic letters really mean a personal name? Could it mean something else entirely? A place? A title? Something lost in the gaps between fragments? It's a fair question. Ancient inscriptions are never perfectly clean, and serious historians should always question evidence before accepting it. But the structure of the phrase, house of, followed by a name, was an extremely common way to identify a royal dynasty across the ancient Near East. It's the same pattern you see in other royal titles from the period. And when language experts examined it closely, the reading House of David held up. Today, the overwhelming majority of archaeologists and biblical historians accept this interpretation. It remains, even now, one of the most debated inscriptions ever pulled from the ground in this field, and historians are right to keep questioning it. That's how real scholarship works. Now, to be clear about what this inscription does and does not prove. It does not confirm every detail in the biblical story of David. It says nothing about a shepherd boy facing a giant. It says nothing about the size of his kingdom or the details of his reign. What it does confirm is something far more fundamental: that a real historical figure named David once existed, and that his name carried enough weight, enough power, enough legacy, that an entire royal dynasty carried his name more than 100 years after his death, recognized even by the people who hated that dynasty the most. For a man some scholars insisted was pure fiction, that's not a small thing. That might be the most important thing of all. This discovery did more than settle one argument. It changed the entire conversation around how we study the Bible as a historical document. For generations, people had been forced to pick a side. Either treat the Bible as a perfectly accurate historical record, word for word, or dismiss it as religious mythology with no historical value at all. The Tel Dan Stele suggested a third path. The biblical text, written and compiled over centuries for theological and religious purposes, could still preserve a real historical core. A core that, when we're lucky, leaves physical fingerprints behind. Fingerprints an enemy king could carve in stone without ever imagining that 3,000 years later, someone would dig them up and use them as proof. Today, those 3 broken fragments sit behind glass in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. Quiet, ordinary looking, easy to walk past if you didn't know what you were looking at. But there's something almost poetic about how this evidence survived. The strongest physical proof we have that King David was real didn't come from someone trying to honor him. It came from an enemy, bragging about a battle, who never imagined his own words would end up confirming the very dynasty he was trying to defeat. History doesn't always get written down by the people who want to be remembered. Sometimes it's written by the people who never meant to leave a trace at all. So, the question worth sitting with is this: how many other pieces of biblical history are still buried somewhere right now, waiting for one lucky strike of a shovel to bring them back into the light?